Okay, here we go. Okay, so I've been looking forward to this week. This is a great week. The lecture I have prepared means a lot to me. I've given this lecture a couple times. It's there's a lot of myself in here. This week we get to read the Communist Manifesto, which maybe isn't Marx's most exciting text to read, but it's certainly the most influential. It's the one that people have read most. It's the one that's gone on to be the most worldly historical text. I think I brought this up when we first got to Marx. In the past 200 years, there's been a dramatic shift in people not wanting to be buried with the Bible. They want to be buried. There was a large shift in that because more people want to be buried with the Communist Manifesto in their caskets. And so why is that? What's going on there? That's sort of strange, isn't it? But so that's what we're going to read. But in the text that, Marx is attempting to do several different things, but he gives us perhaps the clearest explanation of what he means by history. And we'll get to that in a second. This is where we've been in the course so far. We talked about all these up until Marx and Engels. We talked about how in Marx, economics overlaps with freedom, that you can't talk about freedom unless you're talking about economics first. We talked about how for Marx, freedom is creative self-actualization. We get our ideas from the world, but from our head mostly, and through creatively self-actualizing those ideas, through being creative, we express our freedom. That's freedom for Marx. It's not lack of external impediments. It's being creative in the world, using your hands and your mind to work with nature, transform it into art, and then by which you are living forever, because you're creating something that lives past you, beyond you. We will end up understanding what Marx means by citizenship. We will see his idea is that the best citizen is one that is aware of their economic situation, and so the best ones of those are going to be the ones that are actively engaging in revolution against capitalism. So let's get to that. But like I said, having discussed freedom as creative self-actualization, having also discussed the way that freedom overlaps with economics, today we're going to focus on Marx's ideal of citizenship. To call Marxian revolution against capitalism as citizenship, as his idea of citizenship, is a bit of a fudge. Citizenship shows up on the Jewish question, but it sort of largely disappears from his work altogether. Within the context of this course, we can say that Marx does have a concept of citizenship insofar as he has a concept of political action. And the most important form of political action for Marx is worker revolution. Worker revolution both as a means, as an ends. And so let's move on to that, find out what I mean by that. So here I just have a little bit, because I felt sort of strange about jumping from some of the really early stuff. The only things we've read from Marx so far have been really early stuff. We read the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844. We also read On the Jewish Question. Jumping straight to the Manifesto, we're gonna skip some things, and I'm also gonna end up skipping a lot of these other things here. So I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a taste of what we're not going to talk about for the most part. Generally, when we talk about the sort of trajectory of Marx, we talk about him as going from a utopian vision of the political world to a scientific one. And so what do I mean by that? Another way to describe utopian socialism for Marx, it's a moral socialism. It's like we're more concerned about the right and wrong of society. And so you guys heard that when we talked about exploitation and the plight of the worker and stuff like that when we were reading 1844 manuscripts. And even in the Jewish Question, there's this sort of moralizing that's happening underneath it all. And so that's what people mean when they mean utopian, because in that idea, it's like we can construct a better society, and it's going to hit us on a moral level rather than the scientific level, which is sort of clinical, cause and effect, impersonal. He is not, once he gets to this scientific level, it's generally said that he's not really concerned about the morality or how evil the capitalist is. In fact, he never really is that. Even in his earlier writings, he's never talking about how evil the capitalist is. It's never, he never gets to that sort of like moralizing level. But I think it is sort of generally correct to say he sort of, as a young man, he has this sort of tinge of moralism, this tinge of utopianism. And as he gets older and older, he reaches this level of scientist. He wants to just be a clinical cause and effect. Look, this is the economy we have, and this is where we're going to end up. Just look at what's happening, the conditions on the ground, and then this is eventually what's going to happen. And so that's why I've sort of characterized it this way. It's perhaps unfair to characterize it this way, but this is generally what people think of when they think of the trajectory of Marx, as we go from this utopian vision to a more scientific one. So just to give you a little bit of a taste of what's going on here, the German ideology was it has some really famous phrases in it. He describes it himself, Marx describes it as settling accounts with our erstwhile philosophical conscience. And so what he means by that is like he was really influenced by this guy Feuerbach and Hegel and these folks, these sort of philosophical German German philosophers. And what he wants to do is set all that aside and move on to economics. He wants to set aside this like philosophical, like talk about the spirit and just like God and things like that. He wants to set this all aside, and we're going to get down to the brass tacks, study political economy. And so the German ideology is his attempt to sort of write the book that sort of closes the book on philosophy. It's great. It has many passages that are worthwhile, but none of it really fits into the survey course like this one. He does sort of present the first ideas of this historical vision, this idea of history, what history means to him. We use the word the materialist conception of history. That's his word, actually. But what he does say about it is like it never got published. We're talking about the German ideology right now. It never got published. He sent it off for publication, but then like the political zeitgeist of the time wasn't going to allow him to publish. We kind of talked about his life. He kind of had to flee country to country. It wasn't going to be published, and so what he says about it, he says like, I left it for the gnawing criticism of mice, meaning it got shoved into a desk, right? And like the mice, the rats are going to criticize this text instead of like the publishers and the readers and stuff like that. So that's pretty funny. Wage, labor, and capital. Some people think we should rather teach this rather than the Communist Manifesto. It's a much more X's and O's, sort of like X and Y, equals Z idea of like what is capital, what is capitalism. It's sort of a counterpart to a Communist Manifesto. We will discuss how the Communist Manifesto was written as sort of a propaganda piece by communists for communists. Wage, Labor, and Capital was Marx's attempt to write a persuasive piece of work designed to get ordinary workers who don't even read to like understand, oh, like this is my plight. This is like these are my like. My coworkers are not my enemy. These are like, we're part of the same class. But along with capital, eventually, I think capital eventually supplants wage, labor, and capital with like an even more sort of advanced vision of what's going on there. Surplus value is mainly the real concept there. The owner gets to extract surplus value from the worker. The worker doesn't get to receive the full benefit of their the generative power of their work, things like that. The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. So Napoleon had a nephew who came to power because of his name, not because he was any good, right? So Napoleon, right, 50 years earlier, he conquers, much of much of Europe. Falls from power, whatever. They do a whole they try to do a sort of like election democratic republic style country modeled after America. France does. and it kind of goes poorly. And so they have another revolution, and they end up electing Napoleon's idiot nephew, and he was a horrible ruler. And so what Marx does is he writes this sort of rather funny essay called The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, where he just talks about how capitalism ultimately allows for these sort of farcical things to happen in political life. And so there's a very famous phrase where he says, history repeats itself, first as tragedy, but second as farce. And so the tragedy would be the sort of Napoleon, ending the first French Revolution, and then his nephew being the culmination of the second one, which is sort of funny. But the 18th Brumaire also is where we get this phrase that the quote is that men make their own history, but they do not do it as they please. They do not do it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. And so this idea that we are sort of constrained by our conditions, right? We are conditioned. We are not these sort of like atomized individuals that get to do whatever we want in our lives. We actually are constrained even in our thoughts, right? Even in the things that we think that we're free to do. That was given and transmitted to us, right? Our dreams were. And so that's a really sort of famous phrase from Marx there. The Grundrisse is another comprehensive attempt to critique political economy. It's perhaps the most wide-ranging, but it's also the least studied because he wrote it really sort of strangely. He wrote it to himself. He didn't write it for publication. He wrote it as notes. He's up late at night, writing, not really for publication. It turns into a book that's published now that people read, but it was clearly never intended to be published. But it really was another example of what some people call Marx's sort of later career. Is he wrote one book under like 7 different titles. It's all on the same topic. It's all on the same sort of like political economy, critique of political economy. And so the Grundrisse is one of them. We're gonna bring up some ideas from the contribution to the critique of political economy in the next couple slides. It's literally the introduction to this is what we usually talk about. And then obviously capital. Next week we'll talk about capital. The first capital 1. The sequel, and then the third version, the third film in the trilogy were published after his death, but the first one was the one that he was alive to see to completion. Okay, so this is from the contribution to the critique of political economy. It's from the preface to it, and so again, this is attempt 6 of the 7 books that Marx wrote. All of which were the same book, right? And so it's a really famous text because he just sort of really briefly states a couple things that are really sort of foundational in all of what Marxism. When we say what Marxism is, you might end up thinking about something like this. He says, the mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. Again, this is an idea we're going to repeat over and over again. The basic idea here is that we are not brains in a jar moving through history, changing history. Our bodies, ourselves, our individuality comes conditioned from something else, right? Our social being is the thing that determines our consciousness. We don't go out into the world changing the world as individual brains. The world changes us. That's the general idea here. Again, this is idea that we're going to repeat. Any thoughts so far? Am I talking over anybody who wants to talk?
Was that second piece? One time you showed me a book where it was just like pages and pages of math, essentially.
That's capital.
Okay. That's
and
not
so again,
the second we're speaking on.
No, and so again, this is him getting more and more scientific. He becomes a mathematician.
I see.
You
I
know,
missed that. Sorry. Okay.
he starts, you know, we read some of his even earlier ones before this, and he was very moral. You know, he was moralizing. He was talking about the evils of, you know, the working, or how like workers are exploited, and like he would sort of like twinge at your heartstrings, right? Capital is not written like that. Capital is a scientific work, you know, and so it's a sort of like people trying to make sense of that is like this sort of transition here. But so anyway, so we're still in the we're still talking about this idea of the materialist conception of history, this idea that like, and I just want to just sort of like highlight how revolutionary this idea is at the time. So this is like the end of this is the end of the Renaissance and this, and like, you know, the scientific revolution. We really think that ideas and people and individuals are so important. That's like that's a generally accepted fact at this time. And Marx says like, no, material matter, the materials underneath us, the things that we're sitting on, the things underneath our feet. That's what we should be focused on, because that's what ends up structuring our individual lives. And so just to get at this sort of same idea, this is from the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts. This is a different way of saying the same thing, I think. He says, in the social production of their life, men enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will. Relations of production which correspond to a definite stage of development of the material productive forces. The sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which rises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. And so again, it's sort of a strange thing to say. Nobody knows what you're talking about. This is what he's talking about. He's talking about the this is a very famous Marxist idea, the idea of the economic base and the superstructure which arises on top of it. This is his way of understanding what society is. And so if you just sort of look at like what's going on here, I don't know what the size of the phone you guys are using. Maybe it's pretty small or whatever, but like if you look at what's going on here, this thing develops in a spiral. It looks like a clock. And so on the bottom right, which is where Marx wants us to start, this is where we have like the property relations, the landowners extracting rents. Like, how are we associating with our environment, I think is the best way to think about this. Is it one of ownership? Is it one of sort of economic ownership? And so like this is an example, would be like a landowner, you know, it doesn't have to be a landowner. It could be sort of a communal sort of idea, or like a hunter-gatherer type of thing, where like none of this, these are all examples. But the idea here is that it's a relation of production. How are we related to the economic? If you think about the word economics, you know, the history, the etymology of that word is like household management. How are you managing your life? And so in the way that we think about economics, we think of it, you know, because we live in a capitalist society, we think of it like this. We think of property relations, landowners, commodities, the workers and the owners, right? We kind of think of it that way. I'm going to mute Howard because I think his is the one that was causing and then so it goes in a spiral, and then so we move, because of that particular relationship, we have particular types of technologies that are sort of associated with that. We have ways of extracting the wealth from the land that somebody owns, instruments of production. We have factories, tools, logistics, the natural resources that are associated with that. Maybe we could all title these things productive forces, okay? And so the basic idea here is you draw a sharp line here in the middle, and underneath it is the economic base. That is the important thing to look at. Look at the economics, he says. But then you say, like, but there's other things going on. I want to know about society, and you're just talking about economics. Aren't there more things to talk about? Culture, ideas, politics. Who's the president? Doesn't that tell you a lot? And he says, yes, it does. It certainly we should include that in our description. But that's the superstructure. That is shaped by the economic base. Our philosophy, our science, our art, our stories that we tell each other, how we raise a family, how we think about the family unit, how we train each other, how we educate each other, the media, the social consciousness, how we sort of assert, like all of these things are constructed on top of the economic base. It's not that we come up with an idea and we say, oh, I'm going to change my economics, right? The things up here, the superstructure, they certainly maintain the economic base. We tell each other things, stories, ideas, ideology, that sort of makes things like the commodities, the landowners, the property relations, etc. We sort of like they're concretized, to use another word, by religion, education, media, etc. But those themselves are sort of shaped and constructed in the first place by the economic base. Okay, that's the base and superstructure idea. What are the questions we have about that?
I got a question.
Yeah.
Kind of stupid, but natural resources versus commodity, how are those different?
You something could be, an apple is a commodity that is maybe also a natural resource, right? You pick it off a tree. But you also can manufacture a commodity, and you can't really manufacture a natural resource. And so there's like that distinction would be between like, is something, everything is like, a lot of things are commodities, less things are natural resources, right? But some of the natural resources are also commodities. Some natural resources aren't commodities yet. They have to be extracted and packaged and things like that, right? That would be this. It would be a sort of Venn diagram, maybe. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Jeff, your hand's up, dude.
All right. You could have primed me with this idea, which is why I want to bring it up, because I don't want to keep thinking about it if it's not valid.
Okay.
So it feels in a way like he's critically critiquing Kant in a sense, where he's saying like, we're not creating the outside world. In fact, the outside world is creating us, and here are the specific conditions which are doing that. It seems like a direct rejection of Kant in a lot of ways. And like, you put that in my head with like him rejecting German philosophers. I guess is that like at all a valid train of thought?
Totally. My mind goes to Descartes first as the guy that he would be like, what are you talking about? So Descartes would say like, I think, therefore I am. Like Descartes thinks we could literally take our brain and put it into a different body, right? And like, that would be the same person. And I think Marx would have a different idea of that. Marx would say something like, would have a much more holistic idea.
Shut the hell up. My bad, bro.
What? No, and then so yeah, Kant and Descartes and Spinoza, all these sort of like Enlightenment philosophical thinkers, I think would disagree with Marx about this. Would say something like, ideas are way more important than you're giving them. Ideas don't just come after the economics. Ideas are create a lot of things themselves. And I think that would be the debate that happens there. Again, so like what I want to say about this is something like liberalism, which we've sort of constructed a brief critique of in this course, is not in the crosshairs for Marx. He would say, don't look at liberalism, look at the property relations. Look at how you guys think about property. Because guess what? Liberalism, that whole order, came out of the conflict between the bourgeoisie and the feudal order. Feudalism was a thing that happened before liberalism, kings and queens and lords and serfs and things like that. Guess what happened? The bourgeoisie erupted, and some people made more money than others and had access to like creating more money, and they didn't have to give it to the lord. Or in fact, if they did have to give it to the lord, it sort of hindered them from creating more wealth. And so it created this sort of contention between a new class of people, the bourgeoisie, the ones that had owned a new factory, that's a new thing, you know. And so it created a contention between the bourgeoisie and like the feudal lord system. And we had to construct an entire philosophical and political constellation of ideas and institutions in order to help the bourgeoisie defeat feudalism. And that's what liberalism is. It's not the thing that we have to get rid of in order to get rid of capitalism, maybe, but it's the thing that helped capitalism defeat feudalism. And so that's how Marx would sort of talk about liberalism and where it fits into this schema here, you know. Again, so it's not necessary to fully grasp this, but because we're going to return to this idea, that sort of vision of history. But this base and superstructure idea is like, that gets brought up a lot when people talk about Marxism. Another thing that gets brought up a lot is the word ideology, and Marx uses this word very particularly. He uses it when somebody gets called a Marxist. We're usually thinking like, oh, that person has a particular ideology, right? But like the way that Marx is using this word ideology, he would say like, no, Marx is like, he never used the word Marxism, but like he would say something like, no, I am attempting to show you the way it really is. You guys have an ideology that is preventing you from seeing it, right? And so the way that he says this, he says the ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class. And so again, this sort of harkens back to this idea. The ideas of the ruling age are the ruling class's ideas, because guess what? It's an outgrowth of it, you know? The ideas come after. They don't like create the relations or the productive forces. They come after to like sort of enforce it, right? And so our ideas like about justice, our ideas about fairness, our ideas about equality, about the important ideas, the ideas that like really sort of like enliven our lives. Marx would say like those are bourgeois ideas. Those have been given to you by the bourgeois sort of order. And so
does Marx
yeah.
ever critique like feudalism or anything that existed before liberalism?
Yeah, you bet. Well, actually, if you use the word critique, so like he does. I'm not going to tell you about it. I don't have it prepared. But he does talk about how things were before capitalism, certainly. And he brings it up in order to talk about how capitalism got started, because he's really interested about that. And that's actually going to come in a few minutes here. But so anyway, so just to finish what I was saying about ideology, he says your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property. Just as your jurisprudence, you look at what the things you think of as legal or illegal, is but the will of your class made into a law for all, a will whose essential character and direction are determined by the economical conditions of existence of your class. Okay. So what is the American ideology then, is the question for you guys.
Howard,
he
please
says that our ideas. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
Did Howard please enlighten us about the American ideology?
What's the American ideology? Your ideas, Howard, are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property. Your jurisprudence is the will of your class made into law for all.
Howard's Jewish.
I really appreciate that, Jeff. That means a lot. Yeah, I don't know, man. I'm just kind of vibing and listening, but you know, where you kind of lost me was not lost me, but like where I just diverged and it kind of nullified everything you said afterwards, is like everything we do is the result of our conditioning, and so like free will is obsolete, and like personal responsibility is like made up. And
Well,
I'm
so
not saying
good.
that
So
you said
this
those
is
words
American
exactly, but that's, like,
ideology, this
obviously
idea
the
of personal
logical conclusion of
responsibility.
what you said. I can't hear you. You're muted on the speaker because we're trying to I can't hear
Okay,
what
so
you're saying.
the way that you sort of internalize this idea of personal responsibility, that this is a good way to sort of get at this, what Marx is trying to show us, which is like how we condition, how we sort of discipline ourselves to better fit in with the the existing order of things, right? And so the immediate shut off that your brain went into, Marx would say, like, of course, because like the capitalist mode of production has to reinforce itself, and so we have to keep people, we have to prevent people from seeing what it's actually is going on. We have to prevent people from critiquing it, right? That would be something he would say.
Yeah, I guess that would be something he would say, but it's stupid, and it's really like a hopeless way of looking at the world, and a really dark, like pessimistic and nihilistic way of looking at life.
Try and keep an open mind, because I think there's things that are not so easily. Try and reset yourself. If I said something that turned your brain off, try and forget it. I promise there's room for critique. This is not the Bible, but have an open mind.
Okay.
Jeremy, did you unmute yourself for a reason?
No, just so I can just click it on my headset.
So you can do it that.
when
I
the
love
time
that.
comes. Yeah.
That's great. Okay. So and then
right back. By the way, we're going
Jeff.
down.
Yeah.
Brett and I will be right back.
Oh, okay. No problem. This is one thing I want to say, and then we get to move on to the actual manifesto. We're going to go through it like pretty closely. It'll be a lot of fun. And so this is an idea that Marx gives us about how we are going to be able to reclaim our social natures, that we sort of recoil from a lot of maybe from this talk, because our social natures have been sort of neutered, allowed to die on the vine. And in a hypothetical revolution, we are going to sort of be reminded of our social natures. And so what he says here, he says, when communist workmen associate with each other, theory, propaganda, etc., is their first end, right? How are we going to get where we need to go? We're going to talk about the brass tacks. We're going to like, okay, my cousin down the street, he needs some food, but he'll be here next week, etc. But at the same time, as a result of this association, they acquire a new need beyond just eating, fucking, and shitting. The need for society. We're going to be reminded that like eating, fucking, and shitting is not the only biological needs that we have. We're going to find out that we actually need to be amongst each other. And communism, the sort of revolution that will become a means to that, but also an end, right? What appears as a means, doing the communist revolution, will become an end. We are going to find out that we love doing this stuff. We love associating with each other. We love helping each other find food. And things like, we're going to find out that like that's like a part of our human that's like a gene that's like been sort of like excised from our lives, and like I find that really interesting. There's other ideas that maybe come later that sort of get at this idea that like there's like a sixth sense, or like breaking of the fourth wall that can kind of happen, where we find out that life is more than just like our own personal desires and designs. Great. So the Communist Manifesto is co-written by Marx and his lifelong collaborator Friedrich Engels. This was written as a sort of pamphlet designed to get designed in a particular sort of context. And actually the context of it actually gets us right into the introduction of it, which is great. Engels wrote several of the first drafts. Marx wrote the final draft. The occasion of its publication was European revolution against reactionary governance in 1848. There was a sort of like popping up of revolutionary activity all across Europe. And so there was a sort of opening, there was a chance like somebody should write something, right? That sort of like gets people sort of inspired or whatever. The origins of the word communism, there's a London Owet Godin Barnaby claimed to have coined the word in 1840, which is 8 years before this. Marx first used the word in print 6 years before this in 1842. Scholars speculate that the word first came into use in the 1830s. But so this is a brand new idea, essentially, is the idea. It's like a brand new idea. This idea that like, oh, there might be a different way to organize society, right? Spoiler, the proletarian revolution did not occur now or even, you know, any time in the near future from now. But the manifesto obviously survived. And so how does it begin? So again, it begins with a very famous phrase in the introduction. He says, a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. And so he's being sort of dramatic here. He's saying like, and he goes on, he says, what does he say? He says, all the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to excise this specter. All you folks are getting together because you hate communism. The Pope and Tsar, the Metternich and Guizot, the French radicals and German police spies, all you are terrified of this word communism. And we can agree, immediately it's a sort of like pulls you in because like all of us are terrified of communism, all of us, you know, in this room. And so like, we're like, oh yes, you know, it's like a really interesting way to start. And he says, where's the party in opposition? Where are the communists? You guys talk all day long about how you hate communism and how it's a horrible thing and how it's going to destroy society, etc. The specter is haunting Europe. Where are the communists? And what do they have to say for themselves? Well, actually, I am one, and I'm going to tell you. And so that's how what the preface is.
Wait. Sorry. So the preface of this book is what you just said?
Yes.
Okay.
In like 12 paragraphs or so, it's what I just said.
So sorry, I'm just trying to be clear here. He labeled everybody of this mindset communists, or were they already calling themselves?
He's a communist, and he's saying that like all you guys are terrified of communists, and I'm writing to you guys now. You guys are all terrified about it, but where are they? Are they even out there? Like, what do they have to say for themselves? They haven't even said anything.
Got it. Okay, got it.
We don't even know what they're talking about. So let me tell you what they're about, you know? And he says like we've gotten together to actually tell you, but like, I know you guys are all terrified of it.
Before the manifesto, they were word of mouth.
Yes.
Wow,
that's
interesting. Right. That's pretty gnarly. Going all the way back to the builders of the pyramids.
So
flipping of mouth.
The lecture will begin and end with the following major pillars here. First, we're gonna get clear on historical materialism. We're gonna talk about the first chapter, which is entitled Bourgeoisie and Proletarians. We're gonna talk about this idea of the evolutionary Marx, and then also the sort of like other side of that, which is the revolutionary Marx. We're gonna understand what he means by communism, and then we're gonna get to the end of history and what that means. So the actual text itself, after the introduction, it begins with perhaps the most famous phrase in political theory ever written, which is the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. This is the most famous phrase in all of political theory. This is up there with solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This is up there with you know, we the people, etc. What does he mean by this? Have you guys seen this before? Heard this before? What is this? What is this idea here?
See, it's really simply saying like it all boils down to like poor people fighting rich people.
Yeah, the haves and the have-nots. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly what it is.
Fancy way of saying like every conflict boils down to this.
That's exactly what he's saying.
Probably.
So it has been since the pyramids.
Yeah. And so again, this is the idea of historical materialism. Economics is the driving force of history. Politics, society, culture. These are other ways to think about the history of all hitherto existing societies. Other people might tell you politics is the thing that drives history. Wars, personal ambition towards glory or something, right? Like people might have different ways of describing the movements of history, like the main forces. And Marx says like, no, I'm going to give you a vision that actually gets underneath all of that stuff and gets us to what actually moves stuff forward, which is economic conflict. And I think that the best way to say what he means by class struggles is what you said, Jeff. It's, you know, it's the haves and the have-nots.
Brian, your haircut looks super good.
It does? I'm gonna get married with this haircut.
No, it looks phenomenal. I just wanted to let you know that.
Thanks,
Sorry.
dude.
Question. I have a question though. He is not talking about economics in that quote. Is there a longer quote that where he goes into describe the class struggles as an economic struggle? The reason I'm asking that is because I'm frequently reminded in today's atmosphere that it is not a class struggle. It is an economic struggle, right? With racism today in America, for instance. And so I'm just curious, when does he go on to explain what a class struggle is in this book? If that does it make sense what I'm asking? What I'm saying?
Yeah.
Are you putting that on
point.
him, or does he go into?
That's a good point. I think the best way to say this is to say he's not saying that class struggle is different than economics. I think what he wants to say is something like class struggle is like, I think he would want to say to you something like, underneath this idea of economics that you have is this idea of class struggle. And he wants us to sort of envision. And so it becomes hard for us because classes to us have become much more they're a lot more divided in gradations, I think, than Marx was looking at it in his time. I do like your thought. I have to think about that some more. I don't think that he would want you to think that like he's not talking about what you're talking about. Like he would say like, no, I'm talking about economics. Economics is the driving force of history. That's what he's trying to say. I'd like what you're saying though, and I need to think about that myself. But so material conditions are the key to history. The forces of production shape social relations, like we talked about, right? The clock, base and superstructure. They shape social relations of production and vice versa. That clock moves around. These together are the basis of power, political power, culture, ideas, right? It all sort of like moves in a circle. The base conditions the top. Every historical society is divided into social classes. And he goes into detail about this. He says, defined by their access to the means of production. Every age is characterized by a conflict between those who own the means of production and those who do not. In ancient times, it was the freemen and the slaves. In ancient Rome, it was the patricians and the plebeians. In the Middle Ages, it was the lords and the serfs in the country, and the masters and the journeymen in the towns. And finally, in capitalism, the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, and the workers, the proletarians. So that's what he lays out here in the first couple pages. He says like, this is how I'm conceiving of things. And so what's disagreeable about this, I guess? Because like if we disagree about this fundamental fact, we're going to have a hard time moving on. Some people say like, I can't really buy this because I also tend to think that like, it's just not that conflictual. Like there's more to an economic relation than just who has and who doesn't have it. Isn't that something that you might think, or like what else are you guys thinking that like might be different than what he's trying to say?
Well, I guess the only thing Sorry. The only
Jeremy,
thing I
go.
can
No,
think
go ahead,
of
yeah. VIP.
is not that I necessarily disagree with the economics and class struggle being a that
Driving
class
force, yeah.
driving things forward.
Mhm.
I guess from at least what I hear you saying is that it's like he's describing it as really the underpinning of all this, of any other struggle. Is that what you're saying? Like, right?
Yes.
Like, you take
right.
any other struggle, there's like there's a substratum of that, and it's always coming off of this economic thing.
That's right. He's like,
and I
obviously
guess-
there's race and there's other things going on. You could point to other things, of course, but like exactly underneath that.
And so, and I guess, yeah, so the only thing I think of with that, like that comes to mind when you first say that is like, why, and maybe you'll get into it. So, but why that's an underpinning as opposed to either running parallel or interdependent with other things. Like, why does that have to be the underpinning? Because like, if I picture, I mean, I guess it's hard to picture a place where everything's economically even anyways, but just in some hypothetical world, that was the case. Is he pointing to the fact that, say, race, if you bring race into it, that if in some way conceivably that economics was off the table, that there would be no race issue ever? Like if somehow economics stabilized, would the rest of this stuff suddenly just stabilize? Is that right? Is the converse of what he's saying true? That's, I guess,
that's pretty close to a lot of what he has in mind when he says communism. It's like, look, all these sort of social conflicts that we're so hot about that we have to have an entire political fucking news cycle to like hash out. All of these will wither away because what are they really fighting about?
Well,
they're fighting about
a lot of those isn't like race and stuff to convince people of the structure that you don't have stuff, but I have, like with a serfdom, right? Like you convince people with the story of like, I'm a king by God's right. And same thing with race, right? Like it's to the top stuff is like the theater to keep the rest of the economic stuff going, right? Is
that would be the
saying?
Marxist way to retort to this. They would say something like, even the things that we think of as fundamental or as like, shouldn't it be a parallel street instead of just a feeder street or whatever? Shouldn't it be another highway? Another thing that's really important. The only like Marx might say to us, he said the only reason we think this is because those ideas, even ideas like race, I think Rory, your point is well taken. This idea that like people have like a different phenotype than other human beings, which like we know scientifically they don't. There is no like the race is literally constructed. Like we're all human beings, and like the different sort of like skin pigmentations and things like that, like those don't have any sort of like import upon anything other than just sort of like feeding into this idea of like how we're going to sort of associate haves and with the haves nots, and so that they would say something like that. Jeremy, but your point is well taken, because criticizing Marx is like a long and storied, many people, most people I'd say who think about these things deeply don't sort of buy wholesale Marxism. And a lot of what is underneath that is this idea that like, no, there's other things going on. That's like that is like a really in my mind, as like a dyed-in-the-wool Marxist myself, that is one of the most legitimate criticisms of Marxism, is like other things influence this in a way that Marx doesn't, and Marx sort of shortchanges. Marx doesn't say that they don't influence things. Obviously, these things do end up coming back around to change the economic base. The politics, the courts, the laws, whatever, the military. These things do come back down here. Muting Jeff. That stuff does matter, but like not in like a 1A sort of way. The base matters. But again, I think your criticism is one that's well taken. Great. So That's what he has in mind. He wants to give us that, get us there. And then he sort of, this is like the foundational idea to historical materialism. And we get to talk more about it in a second because the next chapter is titled something different, but means the same thing. We get into this idea that like the preceding economic systems create the conditions that move us to the next one. That's what he has in mind. When he says class struggle moves history forward, what he says is feudalism destroyed itself. Capitalism will destroy itself. And we move forward that way, not because somebody wrote a good book, or like talked to a bunch of people. The economics got to a certain point to where feudalism couldn't hold itself up anymore. That's the basic idea here. One way to sort of get at that idea is probably one of my favorite. I get to read some of like my favorite passages here. And it's in the next chapter. And he goes on to describe the character of the bourgeois age. I want to find, and this is a great, Mitch sent this meme earlier. I changed the meme a little bit, but this is precisely what Marx has to say here. He says here, the bourgeoisie has played a most revolutionary part. The bourgeoisie is very revolutionary. Wherever it has got the upper hand, it has put end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value. In the place of numberless, indefeasible chartered freedoms, it has set up that single unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into paid wage laborers. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil. It has reduced the family relation to mere money relation. The bourgeoisie has disclosed how it came to pass that the brutal display of vigor in the Middle Ages, which reactionists so much admire, found its fitting complement in the most slothful indolence. It has been the first to show that man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put all the shade of former exoduses of nations and crusades. It goes on and on. It has pitilessly torn asunder the relations of man. It has turned the family values into money relations. And so the meme here, it said something like it said Barbie, I think, on the steamroller. And it's like Barbie is sort of ruining traditional family, Christian values, sanctity of marriage. But Marx quite literally says capitalism has done this. It has turned your family into something that you have to keep together for tax purposes, right? It has, the linkage that I had with my mother when I was 25 was like I was on my father's health insurance policy. That was like, that's where the link between myself and like my sort of like Philistine sentimental things about my life were about money relations. And so I guess is there thoughts about that? What do you guys think about that?
I'm surprised when you look. He said that it rips it turns a family into
money relations.
When he's talking about family, it's crazy to me because I do think about that a lot, and that just like really I can't believe that he's putting into words so well what I feel the same way. specifically about our family units and how disconnected we are from, like for me and my wife, we have no family around us, right? And they're all like these hyper like
yeah, you have to like buy childcare. You know?
Yeah, exactly. Like dislocated, and there's no like. There used to be like the village elder was your therapist, right. And there was like all of these things that we call like healthcare now that we have to fucking pay for. And really, one thing I don't know if he talks about this, but the way that capital and the pursuit of that capital and the how capitalism has gotten into our degrees and our family lives and our occupations has separated us from other human beings is like so fucking gnarly, especially in America. The hyper individualism that we feel leaves us all feeling so lonely, you know? And so he's talking about all of that here. What's crazy to me is he is talking about this in a way that's so blatantly obvious to him. And he's like he's kind of nasty about it. It's very obvious to him, you know, he's like, it's fucking ripping asunder, and he's like using all this vocabulary that says like he sees it very clear as day.
Yeah.
Right. But no one sees any of this in real life. No one walks around looking at any of this at all. It's all very subtle and very, very deep, you know. And so I guess
that's a good point. Yeah. Thank you. There's another passage I could read that might inspire some more thoughts, but does anybody have anything else?
I was just gonna say, I don't think they see any of it because they would be like on that top sphere, right? Like a lot of the things that we talk about in popular culture and that like that graph you had, like where the economics was below and then above, like all the stuff we really talk about is above that, other than like, I guess, our jobs and stuff like that. But it seems like you call it like super something up there. Seems like
the superstructure.
The superstructure seems like where you keep people lost, and then the economic. Again, like it seems like that's the feeder to keep the economic things going the way they're going. And of course they're like ultimately connected, but
yeah,
one
we
is
have to
way
construct an ideology that supports what's going on, you know, like, and so we have to construct this ideology like, no, this is just naturally what people do. We freely associate, we create enterprises and businesses. Like the reason that you bought a psychologist for your family is because it's good to do it. And like, that's what are you talking about? You know,
I was gonna ask also, is this like, when did like shareholders, I know it's kind of like off topic, I guess, but like when did shareholders become, I know like the East India
financialization of first, like when did capitalism move from like ownership of production into like this sort of like finance capital kind of idea? He's not eloquent about that, at least in this text. And it's something that eludes me. What's that, Maverick?
It was the French Revolution, and when the Dutch East Indian Trading Company started trying to buy fucking islands, and the first time where a company was like, hey, we could like own part of your country if you want. That's when it started.
Well, and where a bunch of people like bought in for the surplus profit.
Well, so this is what he has to say about this. Actually, he says something about this, but it's not about this particularly. It's about this, how capitalism does this sort of thing. And so he says this. He says the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in an unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier epochs. All fixed, fast, frozen relations are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. And so like, it says the need for a constantly expanding market for its product chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere, which, you know, me and Maverick are trying to hire somebody in the fucking Philippines right now. It's, you know, we have to sort of like it, we have to chase, you know, profit all across the globe, you know. But so anyway, so like he's after this idea here that like capitalism is amazing. It like does incredible things. It divides itself in order to sort of like enlarge in the pie, you know, as how I would conceive of this idea of like shareholders, you know. Jeff, yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I keep thinking of like the way in which marketing has evolved to like continuously push this. You know what I mean? Like from like the newsprint ad to the marketing, or to like the billboard to the fucking TV commercial, to like now like social media and like influencer, and like you can trace this idea, I think, in a way through just like the evolution of marketing and how it has like evolved to keep control of the capital that is coming in to specific products more and more and more effectively and efficiently.
Yeah, you bet. There's a passage that I won't read because it's long, but it's really important, where he talks about how like that it's part of crisis theory. He talks about how capitalism creates its own crises, not because it's not making enough stuff, but it's making too much stuff. And so in order to solve that problem, we have to sort of make people buy more stuff than they need. And so we have to invent need. And we also have to give them credit cards, and you know, and so like it turns the sort of like lack of need into another like form of like way to like get yourself sort of indebted into a system that like, so it's sort of, you know, it's like we're after this idea here. If you guys can sort of understand this idea that like it's moving in a way that like nobody can really control, you know, like nobody's at the helm here. And so like, but he's also like, so Marx, it's a mistake to say something like Marx is like anti-capitalist. I promise you guys, it's a mistake to say that, because Marx really sort of sees in capitalism all the productive forces that we recognize in it, but he also sees how that's going to help us and how amazing capitalism is at sort of like solving problems that aren't even really problems yet. And just how wondrous that productive force is, and how maybe we could sort of channel it in a different direction. And so this is what he has to say about that. He says, the bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than all of preceding generations together. Subjugation of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? And I always think that's really funny, because like he's saying like, look, you guys have the, like, social labor has the power here. That's the thing that's sort of like we didn't even know how powerful we were until capitalism sort of unleashed us. Us workers can create whole populations out of the ground in one generation. You know, we can build a Chinese city in the middle of nowhere and have it be like have it be a sort of international city within, you know, 5 years. That's amazing, you know. And you know, Marx is right there on the front lines, sort of almost celebrating this, you know. He's not sort of saying that this is like a horrible thing that's happened to the world and we should go back to feudalism, you know. That's not the argument here. So where does he want us to go? If he doesn't want us to go back to feudalism, he wants us to go somewhere, because, you know, there is something there is an underside to this. And this is what I call the evolutionary Marx, because and I say it like that because I try and make sense of it with what we all know to be Marx's revolutionary program. You know, Marx's calls for a revolution, doesn't he? But no, I think that there's actually perhaps a more interesting idea here than just sort of like workers go take up the torches and you know, firearms and like wrestle away the instruments of production. He wants something. He's got his finger on something else here. And so the passage goes like this. He's talking about feudalism, right? We're back in feudalism. I skipped it. Here we go. Yeah, he says, the means of production and of exchange on whose foundation the bourgeoisie built itself up were generated in feudalism, in feudal society. So if you follow me back to feudalism, we say at the certain stage in the development of these means of production and exchange, so like at a certain stage in feudalism, some folks became wealthy. They had access to particular technologies. They had a cotton gin, or like they had technology that allowed them to rise above their peasant situation. They became merchants, right? They moved to the city and they started selling their wares to other folks that had money, and they used that money to go invest back in in better technology back where where they were living. And all of a sudden, like, they're on the same level as like a lord of the area, right? They have their own hanger-ons, their own, you know, folks that are sort of helping them out, you know. And it sort of becomes strange because that's not what feudalism was designed to sort of facilitate, right? So this is the idea that Marx is sketching out here. At a certain stage in the development of these means of production and exchange, the conditions under which feudal society produced and exchanged, the feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing industry, in one word, the feudal relations of property, became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. They had to be burst asunder. They were burst asunder. Into their place stepped free competition accompanied by social and political constitution adapted to it, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so this is like a really sort of fun and I think interesting and I think like right idea here. This sort of like shows to me why the economic base and superstructure thing works. He says that the property relations of feudalism became fetters upon how productive the bourgeois were becoming. The property relations of feudalism were sort of holding back, right? That's what fetters mean. They were holding back how awesome and how productive and how great and the things that the bourgeois could create. They were holding it back. And so they had to be burst asunder, and they were burst asunder. And into their place stepped free competition, a free market, et cetera, accompanied by a social and political constitution adapted to it, right? We created the constitution. We created an ideology of capitalism after the fact that that technology created, that made it so powerful that the bourgeoisie was able to burst asunder the property relations of feudalism. The feudal lord owning the land that the bourgeoisie was working under, that didn't make any sense. The bourgeoisie had more money than the lord, right? And so it became sort of strange. It became this sort of, it was holding it back, right? They had to give all this money, all these tithings, I think was the word, right? Tithing, or is that religious? They had to, like, you know, give the rent basically to the feudal lord. The lord wasn't doing anything. It became fetters, and they were burst asunder, right? Why does Marx think that is such an interesting idea? Why does he think? And so again, you know, before I ask you guys that, he says this elsewhere. He says this in the Contribution to a Critique of Political Economy. He says, at a certain stage of their development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production. or what is but a legal expression for the same thing, with the property relations within which they have been at work hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters, right? So we have these property relations, these sort of juridical, political, legal institutions, the ways that we think about society and how it should be organized, they become fetters on our technology and how productive we could be. Why is Marx, and so he says, like, this is why feudalism had to be done away with, because capitalism was forming beneath and behind the fetters of feudal production, feudal property relations. Capitalist production was getting more and more powerful, and eventually it burst asunder the feudal property relations. So again, third time I'm asking, why does Marx think that is such an interesting and exciting idea? What does he have in mind? Where are we going to go?
That we could do that to the bourgeois.
Well, it's not that we could, it's that it will. Right? That capitalism is becoming so productive and so powerful and so energetic and unstable, and our archaic ways of organizing society with like property relations and like inheritance and like these like weird things that sort of keep production behind chains. Eventually capitalism is going to get so productive that it's going to burst asunder all that shit. So give me some like examples, I guess, of like what that looks like or what he's talking about. Uh-oh, am I losing a bunch of people?
Yeah, we're trying, dude, but it's 8:30, 8:45, and some of us are getting
okay.
Are losing
it. It looks like I lost a little. So basically the idea here is that like so one thing that like our property relations are making capitalism do that it wouldn't otherwise, perhaps, or our property relations are making sort of the economic engine of history doing that it wouldn't otherwise, is like making our products such that they break after 2 years. Another thing, like we can come up with examples like these things that sort of keep production behind these archaic ways of thinking about society. And it's like, that's the idea here. This is the sort of idea that the fetters are going to get burst asunder. So anyway, it looks like I lost everybody. I don't know where everybody went. And this was like a really exciting idea. I hope maybe
I agree. I think that this is like the crux of his entire this was like very powerful to me when you first were telling me about it fucking 10 years ago, and I've always wanted to investigate it further, the bursting asunder.
Yeah.
Can we start next week? Maybe
I think that's what we
can
should do. Precisely.
Can we go back 2 slides? Can we go back 2
yeah,
slides?
That's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to start next week
by bursting asunder. Yeah, because this is like super important. The train cars and the all that shit,
You bet. I think that's
the
great.
idea that it's not us changing anything, it's just changing itself. That's like very I love that idea.
Yeah.
It's a little fadey. It's going to piss some people off. It's a little Destiny like, but I like it a lot.
Well, I always think that it's like less disagreeable than like some people might want it to be, So
okay,
like,
right.
People are sort of like,
right.
Because we see Marx talking about how exciting it is, how great capitalism is at like getting rid of these things that are keeping us chained to like old ways of doing things, like taxes. Why are we paying taxes? Like why would we even need a state? Like that's like where we're going to end up, So anyway, yeah, I think we should just call it for the day. We've all been here for a while. That was a lot of fun, and we will start next week on this topic. And
so one thing real quick, Derek didn't show up to boys' night or the fucking meeting.
Oh no. Here, I'm gonna stop recording.
Oh, okay.
All right.
Also, just throwing this out there, us all sitting in a room together watching you,
that
not
sucked.
fucking, it does not work. It does not work.